Welcome to Green and Gold FC. We are joined here today by a very special guest, Stefan Szymanski, who is the author of Soccernomics and It's Soccer Not Football. The history behind that, he's possibly the world's leading soccer economist on the planet, currently from University of Michigan, but is London born and raised and lived there most of his life. How are you going, Stefan?
I'm very good. Very nice to be with you.
So can you tell us about Soccernomics? You literally wrote the book on it. What is Soccernomics and how did you get into the subject?
Well, this was co-authored with Simon Cooper, and we met up at a conference in the mid 2000s. And I said to him, "There's a really good book to write about the economics and of soccer and talking about analytics and soccer and so forth." And nobody's done that yet. It was not long after Moneyball had come out. And Simon said, "No, there's no market for that. Nobody be interested in that." So I spent the next sort of 3 months writing him emails, love letters, explaining why this would be a really good idea. And eventually he caved and said, yes, yes. And it's a very nice, I mean, the idea was really for a journalist and an economist to work together. So, economists have lots of ideas, but we're not necessarily always the most articulate at explaining them. And journalists are really good at narrowing down and focusing on the specific point. And so that was the birth. We wanted to say whatever you could from economics and other social sciences as well about soccer, and with a particular focus on things you can quantify.
So in this book, you talk about some of the predictors of success in national teams, why some national teams do very, very well, some do poorly. Can you tell us about some of those predictors of success and whether Australia is underperforming, overperforming according to these metrics?
Right. So I'd go about that in a slightly roundabout way, which is the origin of really my research on this, which goes back to the beginning of the 1990s, would you believe? I was really actually focused on club level football and interested in the relationship between what teams spend on their players and the results they get on the field. And what I found was a group of us at London Business School found was that there's a very close correlation between wage spending and team performance, which really is a manifestation of a market in operation. There are hundreds of thousands of players. There are thousands and thousands of clubs. There's an open market competition for the services of the players. So it shouldn't be surprising that the clubs that end up paying the highest wages attract the best players, and therefore there's this correlation. But when it comes to national teams, though, it's a sort of a different story in the sense that by and large you can't buy success in that way. And of course there have been a few examples of players moving countries, but by and large you're really stuck with your indigenous talent. But that doesn't mean that economics doesn't play a role. So and one of the things that struck me was that it was very simple to look at is you can measure the population size of a country, and presumably the larger the population, the better the chance of finding a superstar. You can measure the GDP, the gross domestic product, basically the income of the country. Then presumably the richer you are, the more able you are to develop that talent. And then you can measure experience. You can measure how long have you been doing this for? Because some countries have been doing this for a very long time and some countries for not so long. And so you can measure those things. And then the question is, how do these three factors, measure quantifiable factors, affect performance? To which the answer is they're pretty significant. And if I say to you, the combined, they explain about 35% of the variation in team performance, probably a lot of people are going to say, oh, that's not very much, is it? To which the answer is, well, these are the three biggest factors. Presumably, there are many, many factors which determine the success of national soccer teams. And these are the three biggest, really, should give you some sense of where teams are coming from. But obviously, good players come and go, and you have variations which are cultural, variations which have to do with just luck. And so, and in fact, if luck didn't play a big role, we wouldn't even follow it. And so what you say is you can explain something, but you really can't. You're limited in how much you can explain. When it comes to Australia, well, of course, Australia is famous for being brilliant at every sport, right? So there's nothing Australians can't do. And obviously, extraordinary history of performance in lots and lots of sports. And the Australian soccer team has given So the thing about Australia is it's not so much that it's a small country. It's not, obviously it's not huge in terms of population, but it's not that tiny if you compare it to other strong soccer nations like Netherlands and Portugal. So Australia's and obviously Australia is wealthy. It's a rich country. So in fact, you'd expect Australia to do pretty well or on average, and maybe actually slightly underperforming. But that I would attribute to two reasons. One is Australia is geographically located in the Asian Football Confederation, and that is in some sense a restraint because the Asian Football Confederation is much weaker than Europe or South America, and so Australian soccer teams don't get to play against necessarily the best competition, and playing against better teams usually tends to raise the standard of your play. And then the second thing, of course, is again, go back to the point about Australians being good at every sport. Australia is spread incredibly thinly across all the sports as well. And that makes it very hard to be competitive in something like soccer. It's because for most countries, it is the number one sport, and the best athletes in the country are going into this. Soccer in Australia is not necessarily getting the very best athletes. It's not necessarily the biggest focus of coaching for kids. And so in that sense, Australia maybe could do a lot better if soccer became the number one sport by far, but that's not happening anytime soon.
So Australia's share that sentiment that maybe we are underperforming and we don't know how to catch up. And some of your work has looked at the attempts of developing football nations in trying to catch up. You called it the middle income trap and how some countries can be caught in that. Can you explain the middle income trap and what it is?
Yeah. So one of the things about football, soccer, is that it is one of the few national performance statistics that is every country has. So if you think about the statistics we can collect about countries, there are essentially three numbers that you could use. We know the population of pretty much every country on the planet. We know the national income, the GDP of pretty much every country on the planet. And then we know the national team soccer results. Those are the three. And so what that and what I did with a German colleague, Melanie Kraus, we looked at applying a method that is used in looking at national income, differences in national income, to differences in soccer results. And in the national income story, there's been this phenomenon that many countries have developed quite rapidly over the last 50, 60 years, but if they've from relatively low levels. And we think about countries like Korea, countries like Turkey. These countries have moved from a relatively low level of income near the bottom end to being somewhere in the middle. But then they've been struggling to make the next step forward, to go from the middle towards the top. And the problem seems to be something about the things that get you to the middle are not the same as the things that get you to the top. So in national income terms, what gets you to the middle is by carrying out basic tasks in production relatively efficiently. So building factories, organizing production, building roads, and in basic infrastructure, these sorts of things, and organizing, enabling businesses to operate relatively freely. Those things tend to help you get to the middle level. But when you reach the middle level, to make the next step, it's something else. The next step is really about being innovative and creative. And that's where the things that got you to being in the middle are not necessarily things that help you in the next stage. So just being good at building roads doesn't make you very innovative and creative. And that's people have coined this phrase, the middle income trap, to describe this problem. They're transitioning from one style of economy to another, which enabled you to progress. And it struck us that you see exactly the same kind of thing in football, whereby again, Australia is a good example. When Australia first came on the scene, the team was a bit naive in the 70s, and it was not clear on how playing the game in the way that everybody else was playing the game, and some maybe slightly embarrassing results back then. But by the 90s, Australia had cleaned that up. That it was easy to learn from the established nations for example, how to defend. Defending is kind of mechanical. There are certain things you have to do, certain things you mustn't do, and you can learn those things. And Australia learned those things. And so the days of Australia losing by 6, 7 goals sort of ended, and Australia became a competitive team. But that's not necessarily the thing that gets you to being a top level team. To become a top level team, you have to score goals, and that's much more difficult. That requires a level of creativity and a depth of coaching knowledge and cultural experience, which few countries, frankly, can achieve, and the same countries win the World Cup over and over again. So that a learning moving from the middle level that where it's that Australia reached to top level is difficult, and you, probably Australia, along with quite a few other countries, in Korea, Japan, for example, they're stuck in this middle income trap where they can do quite well in their local regional competitions, so do well in the Asian Football Confederation, but beyond that, they're struggling when it gets to the world.
Reading a paper about the middle income trap, one thing which struck me is that if we want to produce innovators, it's not just innovators on the pitch, it's innovators across the coaching and everywhere in your clubs and everywhere. So at the moment, we are trying to get better again at exporting players, and we're trying to import European coaching methodology in what we call the national curriculum and some of our coaching curriculum. But in order to be the top nation, it sounds like you need to be the one designing new ways of playing, designing new ways of winning the game, and also being the designing new ways of making clubs which import the best players. Is that correct? That transitioning from the one that exports players to the best leagues in the world and also imports coaching methodology, transitioning from that to one which actually produces new coaching ideas and imports players is just a really difficult transition.
Yeah, it is really difficult. And I think a good example in my lifetime, I think, would be France, where if you go back to the 1970s, France and before, France was always really a very much a second tier nation in football. They were not in line with Italy or Germany or Spain or England. And so they were an outlier, and they could produce reasonable teams, and they were, they perform a little bit like Australia would today, right? That's a similar kind of level. And then what changed in the 80s really was that, particularly the French government to a large extent decided that sport was important for the nation, that football, soccer was the biggest sport. And so money and resources went into developing coaching and training and development. And that bore fruit in the 80s and in the 90s, when, of course, they won the World Cup the first time in 1998. And so, I mean, they transitioned themselves from a second tier nation to what is now unquestionably a top tier nation. And they did this by investment and with a very strong sense of government backing for that. It wasn't really it wasn't really a grassroots movement. And I think that's kind of the challenge for a country like Australia. I mean, the first thing a government would do in Australia if they were going to turn Australia into a world football powerhouse is to say, right, we're banning Aussie rules and rugby league. They're out. Cricket's gone. Or you can only play cricket on occasionally. And then focus on soccer. And of course that's never going to happen, right? So and probably just as well, that's never going to happen. But that represents, I think, the challenge for a country like Australia, which is, after all, you have middle class respectability. What's wrong with that?
If you were in charge of the Australian government and you wanted to turn Australia into a powerhouse and you ruled out any sort of death to Aussie rules or other other sports, you just were like, okay, we'll give you some purse, we'll give you some money. What are you going to do with the money? What sort of things could either the government or private sector investors who are passionate about Australian football do? What would that program look like in detail?
Well, so here's one idea. I think why not create a thoroughgoing system of promotion and relegation throughout the Australian system? So again, what the idea is, in my mind, is that to create a national football culture, it needs to go right down to the bottom. You need to see at every level of the game, you need to see some interest and commitment. And the problem when you don't have promotion relegation is, what is the local interest? Of course, if you're in a big city with a big team, then that can be great and wonderful. You can get behind that. But if you're a modestly talented player playing for some lower level club, what's in it for you? What's the future? The future is, well, do I improve my skills? Maybe I could get better. Well, for what? I mean, I'm stuck in this club. Am I ever going to be able to move up? Well, maybe if somebody comes and sees me, but there's no real overall incentive. And it's a sort of the absence of promotion relegation really is an incentive to undermine the grassroots. And again, if I take the example of the United States, and again, for me, baseball is always kind of the archetypal example because baseball grew up in the same era as soccer and had the same kind of depth of grassroots interest in the United States that soccer developed in the rest of the world. And but never had anything like a promotion relegation system. And what's happened is that there is a kind of a baseball desert out there. Unless you're in a big city, there's very little. There's not that much baseball going on. There's minor league baseball, which isn't very interesting. And where does the talent come from? The talent is mostly or a large fraction of talent is actually being imported from the Caribbean and South America, and some of it from Japan. I don't know if you follow this guy Otani, who's just played the most incredible game in Japanese. They they have actually lost the ability to develop talent in the United States, or significantly diminished ability to develop talent in the United States, because again, there's no pipeline up the system. There's no real route that people can take to the top, and I think becomes a real problem for the development of talent.
So promotion relegation is one of the most passionately debated subjects in Australia. People say that it can't work here because of our geography. We're more spread out. It's gotten itself tied together with some of the biggest ideological fights in our country. For example, a lot of the grassroots clubs or the traditional clubs have a very strong association with migrant clubs. And our current system at the moment, we have franchises which are started from scratch at the top division, which had a identity base around the entire city. So they ended up having bigger crowds and everything. And so it kind of got tied with essentially two ideologies. First was the debates about multiculturalism. People accused a lot of the migrant clubs of being un-Australian. And secondly, it got caught up in the debate about professionalization. So the PFA, the Players Union, really wanted to get professional wages, play for clubs big enough to support those professional wages. And the franchise was seen as being able to do that. And one of the fears is if we have promotion relegation and say a Melbourne Victory gets relegated or Sydney FC gets relegated, maybe a club can't survive in the lower divisions and it blows up as a club. And the club which replaces it, even if it's better in sporting merit, ends up not being able to pay professional wages. So it became this weird mixture of people who are skeptical from pragmatic reasons to people who had passionate views about multiculturalism to people who had passionate views about player professionalism and player wages. Can promotion relegation work in Australia? Have you looked at the Australian situation much?
Well, yes and no, in the sense that I'm familiar, just like I said, with the Australian football landscape. But the question about whether promotion relegation could work in the United States, in Australia, is sort of similar to the question of whether it could work in the United States, which is, to know whether it will work or not, you have to suck it and see whether it works. So the question really one would want to ask is, well, what evidence do we have to say that it would or would not work? Well, how would we base that evidence? Well, one piece of evidence is to look at promotion relegation in other countries in the world. Does it work anywhere else? Are there some places it works and some places it doesn't work? Well, across the world, something like just over 100, I think about 120 national associations have a promotion relegation system. The ones that don't tend to be very small countries. So, the Turks and Caicos Islands in the Caribbean, I don't think they have promotion relegation. I'm not sure, they might do, but they have a population of 30,000 people. So if the country is really, really tiny, maybe there's no promotion relegation system. But a country the size of Australia, in terms of population, could clearly sustain promotion relegation. And then the geographic objection is saying, well, the distance is traveled, and that's always been an issue in all sport. Not and whether you, in fact, whether you have promotion or relegation or not. Of course, in Australian rules football, the Victorian Football League was originally just Melbourne, right? And it was just, the travel costs were negligible. Um, and presumably part of the reason that rugby league succeeded in other parts of Australia, New South Wales and Queensland, is that, in fact, they were the Victorian Football League were not going to play games in other states because it was too far to travel. Well, obviously, two things to say about that. We've come a long way since then, when travel is much cheaper and much easier. But also, again, Australia is not unique in having these geographic challenges, and the solution in other countries has been to have where national leagues are not viable, to have regional leagues. So if I take the German example, for example, and Germany is quite a late developer in this front. So Germany doesn't have a national league until 1963, and then that's the first time they have a national football league. But the other leagues beneath that are all regional. So you have promotion and relegation, but you can promotion and relegation from lower level regional leagues. Then in 1978, I think it was, they introduced Bundesliga 2, and that was that became the second national league, as again became more feasible to travel. And then in about 2000 they introduced Bundesliga 3, the third level, which became national. And so you can operate national leagues if it's economically viable, and you can have regional leagues if it's not. But all the while, you can still have promotion relegation. You can have promotion relegation from a national to a regional league. And that happens pretty much everywhere in the world. So again, you'd have to say, why would Australia be any different? Yes, there are geographic constraints, and the structure would have to reflect those constraints, but it still doesn't explain why you couldn't have it at all.
So I want to give a couple of case studies from other sports. So rugby league in the UK, I don't know if you follow it. It gets pretty healthy crowds. They don't have travel restrictions. Their crowds are about 10,000 people per game in the top league, so very, very healthy. Most football soccer leagues in the world wouldn't have crowds that big. And obviously England is tiny, so travel is really cheap. And yet it looks like promotion relegation isn't working there. They're thinking about scrapping it in rugby league. Kazakhstan is a country where the distances are vast. The distance between teams in the second division, around about 2,000 to 3,000 miles, is enormous, actually. And the crowd averages in the second division are only 620 from the last season, so absolutely tiny, much less than 10,000. And yet Kazakhstan, despite having a football participation of just 1 million, similar to Australia, being as spread out as Australia, being much poorer, football being actually less popular in Australia, promotion relegation can actually work there because they've been having it. They've had a second division. They had promotion relegation for decades. Is there something different about the economics of soccer and the economics of different sports, which makes promotion relegation both necessary and possible for soccer, but not either necessary or possible for other sports?
So if by economics you mean, is there something intrinsic in the structure which means that it can't work, like a mechanical system that will fail because it's, you're trying to push water uphill or something like that, then no, there's no economic obstacle. What there is what I would sort of describe as political economy, which is, if you have a promotion relegation system, there are winners and losers. And the issue usually for a country like Australia is often about who will be the losers if you move to a system of promotion relegation, and do they have sufficient power to block a change which would be disadvantageous for their interests rather than the interests of the sport as a whole. So I would argue that promotion relegation serves the interests of the whole sport, largely because it creates this dynamic system that promotes interest in the game, that provides extensive community support. You have very deep roots in promotion relegation systems, clubs going down to all levels. But the big losers in a promotion relegation system are the team owners, because they end up spending lots of money either to avoid getting relegated, or when they get relegated, try to get back up to the top level, or when they're at a lower level, just trying to make it there for the first time. Basically, it's a form of hyper competition in some ways. Now, I'm an economist, so I don't think that it's a good idea if we just have one supplier of anything. I don't think it's a good idea if we have one supplier for of food needs, one supplier of restaurants, one supplier of telephones, one supplier of cars. I think we need competition, and I think competition keeps the suppliers honest and makes sure that consumers have a choice and some alternative if they're not happy. And effectively, promotion and relegation does exactly that. And give you perhaps a local example. I'm where I live is my nearest NFL team is the Detroit Lions. The Detroit Lions won the NFL championship way back in 1957, even before there was a Super Bowl. And they have been lousy pretty much every year since. The last couple of years have actually got good again for the very first time. But I worked out if everybody in the NFL had an equal chance of making it to the Super Bowl, what was the chance that the Detroit Lions wouldn't have made it for a period of 67 years? To which the answer was, if they had an equal chance, then it would be about the probability of actually making it to a Super Bowl would be less than 1%, and actually winning the Super Bowl would be not winning the Super Bowl would be about 1%, something like that. Clearly, and there's no reason why the Lions couldn't offer a competitive team. It's just their owners didn't have to bother. They were a basement team. They never won anything. They're still there. They get a share of the broadcast money. They can be lousy, and nobody cares. And so that's the problem with the closed system. It promotes this kind of mediocrity in the sense of there's no incentive to try, whereas a promotion relegation creates incentive for people to try and make their team successful. Nobody can sit back and give up. And of course, businesses and people who run businesses that operate teams do not like competition. That's why we even have to have laws to say that it's illegal to try to stop competition. And that's why, in some ways, I mean, you could even argue that promotion and relegation should be legally mandated by the government, because it's effectively not having it is a restraint of competition, which in any other business would be considered illegal.
So let's talk about what that competition does in terms of numbers of and how much people are getting paid. So our owners are complaining how much they're paying and that they're losing money running the A League. And we know roughly their player wages, it actually came out, it's 4.8 million Australian dollars per club. And we know that their income, their revenue is about 10 million per club. Recently in the UK, there's been some fair play changes to the fair play system where they're trying to cap what fraction of revenue gets spent on player wages. And I was surprised to see that as 90% was the initial cap, which implies that people are paying even more than that. If we had promotion relegation, that the wages would roughly double, essentially. How is this economically viable? Because the owners right now are crying poor. They say they can't afford to run the A League. How is this economically viable to have that much money spent on player wages?
Well, one thing to remember about owners is they always say they can't afford. I mean, there's never an owner says, "Oh yes, I'm flush with cash. Let me spend some." That's not the way it works, right? So here's the thing. So professional sport is different from most other businesses. So, for example, if I start a business making cardboard boxes, I'm going to need to make money out of that. It's going to be hard work. It's going to be pretty dull. People aren't going to come to me and say, "Stefan, we love you. You make cardboard boxes. You're so wonderful. That's so great." They're just going to say, "Sell me a cardboard box." The only return as an owner I get out of that is making money. And that's true for most businesses. And that's, in fact, why we think it's worth preserving the profit motive, is that otherwise people will not necessarily have the incentive to provide very useful things like cardboard boxes. Owning a football team or a sports franchise is different, in the sense that One, and in fact, often if you talk to somebody like somebody who owned a cardboard box factory, got very rich, and then bought a sports team, they'll tell you that they were really shocked by the sudden change in their lives because suddenly people are interested in you, they're interested in what you're doing for the club, and if you win, you become an absolute hero. People adore you and start chanting your name, and you become. And what if your team is successful? Then you find politicians want to spend time with you. Again, not true in the cardboard box industry. You find that celebrities want to come see you. Again, you don't find many celebrities saying, "Oh, I really want to spend time with cardboard box manufacturers," but they do want to go to the games. I mean, look at Taylor Swift and the Kansas City Chiefs in the NFL. Um, it really that so there when you buy a team, when you own a team, there are really two dimensions to your investment, to what you get back. One is financial, but the other is this what the economists call amenity value, which is sort of the glory, the satisfaction, the reputation, the publicity that you get from being the owner of the team. And that is hugely valuable. And what we see in the world is even in the US where the franchises make money because they don't have promotion relegation, even when they make money, the valuation of these franchises is way in excess of the profits that they generate. The valuations are not they're not being treated like ordinary businesses. And that's because there's a long line of billionaires out there waiting to say, I'll take the team off your hands if you don't want it. So that's the thing, I think. Yes, if you had promotion relegation, yes, the owners would lose money. But so what? I don't care. Then the question becomes is will these clubs fold if they can't make money? And so again, this is not something where we should die wondering about what would happen. Just look at the history of football all around the world. You see clubs go bust all the time. You see clubs get into financial difficulties every day of the week. Financial distress is the absolute norm in the world of football. But you find me a club of any significance that has ever disappeared and you won't be able to do it. Let me give you an example. In the 1950s, just after the Second World War, there was a huge expansion in entertainment. This would have been true in Australia as well, though I haven't seen data for Australia. But it's certainly true in England and it's true in the United States. The end of the war leads to this huge boost. So what you see in again, baseball is the biggest sport in America at that time. So you see a huge rise of interest in baseball in the United States. And there are these minor league teams, and they are in the number of teams expands in the space of 2 or 3 years from 100 to 450. And then by 1960, they're back down to 100. This is huge collapse. And many, many towns and cities that had a minor league team in the 1950s have not had one since. Now, partly that was driven by television. Television provided a substitute activity, so people started watching TV. They watched TV, and therefore they were less likely to go to watch minor league baseball. But the thing about that is that television came to England at almost exactly the same time. And you've got exactly the same phenomenon. People started going less often to the football and more often staying home and watching TV. And yet none of the clubs disappeared. Well, actually one did. But out of the 92 clubs in the English league system at the time, 91 of them are still with us today. So in that sense, that you have this sort of paradox that the promotion relegation system creates a lot of financial instability at the level of the individual club. But it also systemically is much more stable than a closed league system where franchises come and go, mainly because there's limited opportunity for progress in the absence of a promotion and relegation system.
So if we did have promotion relegation, people who fear, oh, maybe Melbourne Victory could go bust or Sydney FC could go bust, there is some weight to that fear that could be real. But what you're saying is something other clubs would take their place and the system as a whole would improve and be better. Is that right?
No, I wouldn't say so. Yes, if Sydney FC went bust, then other teams would come up and might take their place in the top league or whichever league they happen to be playing in. But no, Sydney FC would not disappear. Sydney, the owner of, so the way to think about this is to distinguish between the club itself that plays soccer and Sydney FC Limited, the corporate entity that owns the football club. And those are two very different things. If Sydney FC went bust, what that would mean is the limited company would go bust, which means the owner of the limited company would lose their money. The owner would lose their shirt. But would Sydney FC then fold and disappear and shut down? No way. The fans would find some way to promote the idea of reviving the club. A local businessman would step in and be a hero. They'd be the local hero. And again, I'm not idly speculating on what this could happen. I'm saying this is the evidence of thousands of football clubs around the world that never disappear, but are always revived by some local businessman or by the fans themselves who say, we're not going to let our club die. And what that does is it creates this incredibly powerful infrastructure of support for the local team, which again ultimately raises the standard of the game and makes the teams and ultimately the national team competitive.
It is interesting because we do have examples of that in Australia, of the club going bust, and often the club keeps their IP. But then you have another club. We have Gold Coast United, Brisbane Strikers, Northwest Sydney Spirit. They had to change their name slightly because of, I believe, copyright issues. These people who cared enough about the identity of the club, really, to make their own thing in the lower leagues, and they stayed in those leagues and kept going. In fact, of all the clubs which have tried to go into a lower league, only one has gone bust and permanently disappeared. So, as you say, we do have actual evidence, and some people might dispute whether it's the same club because it's not owned by the same LTD or anything like that, or the same owners. But in the end, you still have those fans, you still have that those people, right?
Yeah, and you get some weird stories about it. So, for example, in Scotland, Rangers FC, one of the historically biggest clubs in the country, they went bust in the early 2000s, I think, and the limited liability corporation had to be wound up. The IP and the club and the ground were purchased by a new company. That company was called something, I think Sevco 32 or something like that was the name. And the Celtic fans, historically the huge opponents of Rangers, and they will still refer to, they say there's no Rangers anymore. It's just Sevco 32. Sevco 32 has no history. They never won any championships or anything like that. And the thing is that lots of I would back in the day, I got into some arguments with Celtic fans about this very point because they were adamant that this was true, and yet the facts on the ground were obvious that Rangers fans identified with this new limited liability corporation because the limited liability corporation is irrelevant to the meaning of the soccer club. The meaning of the soccer club is its community, and that's why these arguments about whether it's really the successor club are just silly, because it's not about a chain of title of ownership. It's about a chain of community involvement in soccer. And even if sometimes the club might have to move to ground or change its colors or whatever, it doesn't really make that much difference to the fans in the community because they know it's their club. And that's what keeps the club going. What I think about their community doesn't keep their club going. Certainly what people who don't even like them think about their community doesn't keep them going. It's what they think about their community that keeps the club going. And the evidence is always people have a strong sense of identity with their local football club, and that's what keeps them going, regardless of what happens to the money.
So I mentioned some of the ideological debates about promotion relegation, which appear in Australia. And one of the main ones is that these franchises are uniquely able to provide professional wages. And so the Players Union 20 years ago, they really liked these franchises. And they might, I don't know what their opinions are today, but they might fear promotion relegation as a system in which they'd be worse off. Is there any legitimacy to those fears, or is there more positive trade-offs for the players than negative ones?
Well, there is always an issue within promotion relegation because the individual clubs are relatively unstable compared to a franchise system, it does mean that non-payment of wages is often an issue. And one of the things that leagues in many countries have done is introduce regulations to ensure that the players get paid. But that's something that players' unions do. You can get the league or the clubs collectively to underwrite the system. So for example, one way to do this is to say that the league has to pay a fixed percentage to the player union every year, and that they create a fund. And out of that fund, if a club goes bust, they use that money to pay the player wages. So it's a kind of a manageable economic transaction. But I think the other point about this is that a franchise system will do is it will ensure that the players at the top get relatively safe salaries and long-term contracts, but it means that every player beneath them really struggles. So, for example, again, go back to my baseball example. There is still minor league baseball in the United States. The most people watch Major League Baseball, which is the top 30 teams. If you play in Major League Baseball, you can get contracts, and some of these contracts are worth literally hundreds of millions of dollars. So you can get really, really well paid. But if you're in the minor leagues, you get paid next to nothing. So there's this huge cliff you fall off if you're not in the major leagues. And the vast majority of professional baseball players are not in the major leagues. They're in the minor leagues. When a promotion relegation system, even players in the second and third tiers can get decent wages because their skills might enable the team to get promoted, which will then enable it to make more money and then to rise up the system. So I think actually it's, yes, the franchise system might work for a small elite of players. And in many cases, perhaps even don't even have to try that hard after a while because it's harder to come up through the ranks. Whereas a promotion relegation system will sort of there's not quite so much money at the top, but the money spreads down through the system and enables you to have a larger workforce, if you will, in the system.
So I talked about things which might be unique to the economics of football before. I want to float a couple of ideas which I've had and talk about how that might affect promotion relegation. I want to get your reaction. The first is football seems to be so low scoring compared to other sports. So if you give me a meaningless football match versus a meaningless rugby league match, it feels like a lot more is happening in the rugby league match because there's a lot more scores. But if you give me a meaningful football match, then there's nothing better because at any second that team could score, your team could score, and that could just completely change how your season, the fortunes of your clubs, and so that low scoring nature of football goes from a net negative to a net positive if games are meaning. And so, does this mean that promotion relegation there's more of a drive to have it in football? I notice in football you have cup competitions or promotion relegation and almost no other systems. Does that create the low scoring nature of football? Does that create a drive towards promotion relegation compared to other sports?
It's an interesting point, I think. I mean, you're right. I mean, the whole idea of a football game match is that you're always on a knife edge, but or almost always. I mean, there are very few blowout wins one way or the other, and so things can change instantly. And I guess you're right in the sense that does mean that's an extra excitement going down to the wire. I mean, I don't know how big it is as a factor in promoting promotion and relegation. I mean, I think uh, I think of it more in terms of the longer term consequences, in terms of incentives to invest and so forth. But I think you're right. I think the low scoring, it might well be, and I don't think anybody's looked at this carefully, but I think it might well be that the low scoring nature of soccer does actually encourage create more it certainly could create more tension and therefore perhaps creates even more interest in the promotion relegation battles. Although I don't know, I would have thought in rugby league, if you're at risk of going down if you lose the game, I think that would add quite a lot of extra excitement to that game.
Yeah, I'm just asking these questions because I'm curious about why rugby league it didn't work in a fairly successful league in the UK. Promotion relegation didn't work.
Well,
I guess yeah.
Yeah, I mean, one thing to bear in mind about rugby league is that yes, it is very successful in very small pockets of England, but it's really not very widespread at all. And even in its areas where it's strong, it faces strong competition from soccer. So, I mean, rugby league has been living, and of course, you've got the other code, rugby union, which is in some ways is it's actually much bigger, more widely played. And so rugby league is very much sort of narrowed down to these very small communities. And so it's just as well. It's to me, it's a bit like the Turks and Caicos Islands. You have a very small population, and so it's really quite unlikely that you could even get enough professional clubs to make a promotion relegation system.
Yeah, I mean, and actually, that's the second point I had was thinking about is different about the economics of football is just how many people play it. Even in Australia, where it's maybe the fifth or sixth most popular sport in terms of the attendances and interest in the top league, the people who play the sport outnumber the other codes combined. And of course, that's 1.3 million play in Australia. In England, it's 14 million if you ask the FA, 15 million if you ask the Football Foundation. Uh, and so that means if you look for the 200th best rugby league club in Australia, and you compare that to the 200th best football club in Australia, there's no competition. They all have a big community around them of maybe 1,000 people who play juniors, who play seniors, who play amateurs, and there's just no equivalent in almost any other sport. Do you think the sheer depth of clubs that you get, which means that even if the top isn't as big as the NFL or the AFL, the roots just go so deep in football compared to other sports?
Yeah, I think that's right, and I think again, I would say a lot of this comes back to the notion of community and the idea that these teams represent, in some ways, represent who you are, and your view of who you are is not fixed in this world. So even if you're at the bottom of the pile, we all think we're above average, right? We're not. None of us think we're below average. So in that case, what I think that means, what happens is that everybody in a promotion relegation system, everybody thinks that they can achieve their just desserts, which is to be in the top half, not in the bottom half, right? The problem with closed systems is you have to accept it's like a feudal system. You have to accept that you're just inferior, and that's never going to change. You're just stuck in this. And I mean, so I because the other analogy I would draw, which is something in the US which is really big, which is college football, American football. And that is vast and that covers the whole country. And there are hundreds and hundreds of college football teams. But again, they represent communities, and everybody understands that they represent the local community. And what they have and they have an interesting problem, which is what they have is they don't have promotion relegation, but what they have is a constant process of conference realignment. If you look at the teams over many seasons, they're constantly changing which conferences they're begin with. So in some sense, even in the US, without promotion relegation, you get some kind of mobility because no one wants to be stuck, right? No one wants to be told you're the ninth level and you're always going to be the ninth level, and that just suck it up. We all want the opportunity to rise up in the system, and I think that's why promotion relegation is so effective at promoting community.
So finally, we've just launched a national second tier here, and it's a bit of a shortened season, so it's only a 6-week season. No promotion relegation from the top, but there is promotion relegation essentially between the national second tier and the tiers below. It's sort of, and it's only 6 weeks. It's only just starting. So I wanted to ask, the reason why we don't have a home and away is because essentially we have a set of minimum criteria that we need that we've been asking these clubs, the governing bodies have been asking these clubs to meet in order to have a home and away second tier. But we couldn't find enough clubs, at least not enough clubs outside of New South Wales and Victoria. Would you recommend just keep searching, just having that carrot? If you reach this criteria, you can play in the national second tier, but we're going to keep this criteria? Or would you recommend just saying any club that wants to play in the second tier, just get promoted, we'll start the second tier?
Yeah, sorry. What could you say what the criteria were? I didn't catch that.
Yeah, so usually it's we don't know the criteria because they're behind non-disclosure agreements, which is one of the frustrating things about this. It's hard to criticize or affirm whether the criteria is rational or not. But the criteria essentially appears to be good enough to have a broadcast agreement with SBS, I think, which is one of the public broadcasters. So it's like whatever the minimum standards needed to get it on TV. So I notice a lot of European national second tiers don't have it on TV, but so it might be something to do with that. So we do know there's criteria about the junior development and the academy. We know it has something to do with that. We know it has something to do with the infrastructure and having like maybe not stadiums, but at least enough sufficient seating. So we know there's like criteria about that. I think there's some financial criteria about what sort of player wages they can manage, but it's hard to know which are rumors because everything's behind these NDAs.
Right. So, I mean, here's what I think is the problem. Is that sport is incredibly attractive and incredibly powerful part of our modern lives. And so if I, as a business person, can get control of that, there's a lot of money in it for me. And there's a money, prestige, power, influence. And so what you see in a lot of sports is the attempt of a group of a cartel of individuals who seek to organize control, impose their rules and regulations, and present a structure as a fait accompli. And really, and you can see that in the US, where again, I would argue that one of the big problems in the US is, you have 32 NFL teams for a country of 350 million. That's insane. It's just not enough. You have 30 Major League Baseball teams for a country of that size. It's insanely small numbers. Um, so, but they have cartelized the industry, and there's right now there's not much you can do about it. What Australia has, and what other football federations around, other football countries around the world have, is a national federation, the national association, which has the role of imposing rules and regulations, and they could mandate more open systems. And my understanding was the National Association is keen on promoting relegation and does want to promote it. And I think there's a kind of a battle here. And there's what's in economics, there's something called regulatory capture, where effectively, your local electricity company, which is supposed to be regulated to keep costs down, actually ends up taking over the regulator and putting them in place, and then making sure that they get the price rises that they want. Well, I think the same thing happens in sports. And I think the issue in Australia is probably one of what I call sportive regulatory capture, whereas the organizers of these leagues, at the top league, of the second league, they're trying to um, rig a system which will enable them to make money out of running football. And they need to be stopped. The world proves that you do not need to be able to make money to have a thriving football system. If money was essential, Spain, England, even Germany and Italy, they would all be disappeared long ago. And they don't make money, and yet they produce the best football in the world.
It's very insightful because indeed we do have a Congress right now, where 28% of the votes are run by the top division, and 13 indirect votes are by the top division. So that's nearly half of the vote. So it's that's been one of the key issues of trying to get anything off the ground. So it does look like we indeed have regulatory capture. I hope there's a way out of it. Maybe we need government intervention. One final question. You wrote a book also about the history of the word soccer and football. And maybe we're wrong to think that soccer is the American jingoistic term for it, and football is a more multicultural world game sort of word for it. Actually, the history is a little bit more complicated than that. Can you give us a bit of a rundown of that?
It is interesting. So you will find Brits everywhere who will tell you that you mustn't use the word soccer. That's an Americanism. And that's just not true. And it struck me, I grew up in England in the 1970s, and my recollection was that people used the word soccer back then. So that's got me interested in looking at the history of this. And when I looked at it, indeed, many books were written with the name in England with the name soccer. And it was what you can find, you go through the newspapers, and it's widely used, and nobody says it's an Americanism. And then if you look at the long-term history, actually it turns out that this was a word apparently coined at Oxford University in the 1880s. And someone at the National Football Museum in Preston, in England, actually came up with what we think is now the first reference to the word soccer in 1888. So far from being an Americanism, it's an Anglo word and comes from Oxford University. And indeed, I found an early reference, would you believe, in the Adelaide Advertiser from 1899, actually saying exactly the same thing. That this is a word come from Oxford and used to describe the game. What happened was that in the 1970s, there was a league in the United States called the NASL, the North American Soccer League, which imported many of the world's best players, including some of the best players from England at the time. Players like George Best, Bobby Moore came to play in the United States. And that was the first time the Brits even got an inkling that Americans played this game. And then they realized that the Americans called it soccer for the very obvious reason that if you don't, they have a game which they play called football, which is not the same game. So you need a different word. That's pretty logical. And since it was an English coinage, it was pretty reasonable to call it soccer. But the Brits took umbrage when they realized that this was the American word because they hadn't known anything about what Americans called it. And that's when, and you can see, I actually looked in comparing, say, mentions of the word soccer in the New York Times to mentions of the word soccer in the London Times. And you can see as it rises in the US in the 70s, it starts to go into decline in England in the London Times in the 70s and 80s. And of course, Australia has its own kind of turf wars about this issue and about what the right word to call it is, and whether soccer is the indigenous word or whether you should use the global word. And I know there's been quite a lot of angry back and forth about this. All I will say is this: soccer's a perfectly good word. Football's a perfectly good word as long as you know which football you're talking about, and that's obviously key to the whole discussion.
Fair enough. That's good news. We don't have to change our name from the Socceroos to the Footballoos for our national team.
Please don't. Please don't.
So thank you so much for joining us, Stefan. Please, if you have any comments, join us on greenandgoldfc.com for the discussion which is happening there. We're also on Twitter, Apple, Spotify, and YouTube. Please remember to like and subscribe. And until next time, that's all we have time for. It's bye for now.